Welcome to the All for Literacy podcast, the podcast that brings together dynamic voices discussing the implementation, efficacy, and equity of science of reading transformation. Whether you are leading a classroom or a school building, a district or a dinner table, we are your literacy community. Today we're joined by my dear friend, Dr. Marisa Ramirez Stukey, Chief Academic Officer of the Reading League and a recognized leader in literacy, professional learning, and innovative systems design. Marisa, welcome. Lexia and the Reading League are partners and advocates in the science of reading. We believe deeply in the body of evidence that tells us how the brain learns to read, why so many students struggle with some component of reading, and most importantly, what instruction will mitigate that struggle. Now, when you and I met, we met at the Big Sky Conference when you delivered a very beautiful and elegant presentation on the science of learning. And I would love for you to tell us a little bit about yourself and your background, and also why, as science of reading experts, it is so important that we understand the sciences around the science of reading.
Well, thank you, Kerri, for having me. And what a lovely introduction to a lovely conversation we're going to have together. Just as a little background, I started teaching first grade in the late 90s and have since developed into lots of really interesting things as my career has just evolved over time. And one of the things that I have found the most impactful is really the marriage of literacy and professional learning. My career over time has really been the meeting of those two things. And how do we continue to support teachers in the hard work that they do every day to ensure that every child learns to read and is deeply literate and has critical thinking that we know are necessary for moving our nation and our world forward? So that's been kind of my life's work. I'm so honored to have spent time with you and learned from you along the way. And our meeting at Big Sky was so serendipitous in terms of, really was, right? In terms of really thinking about the science of reading and the science of learning. And I think in the last 6 to 7 years, when the science of reading has really just become so much more into the mainstream, the science of reading really helps us know what's necessary. But what the science of learning helps us think about is how that comes to be in the world. And I think that science of learning, the science of teaching, implementation science, all these additional bodies of work are necessary to add to the conversation now around the science of reading, because we want real change to occur. And the science of reading is only one part of that change that we know is necessary. And so I think that presentation just started off the conversation in terms of what else is really important for us to learn from research in order to make a difference for our students.
I think that presentation that you delivered named and filled in so many gaps for me, because when I came to really better understand the science of reading, I came to it from the perspective of a special educator who's looking across all children who have distinct and individualized needs, children who by design have been divided into categories of disability and need so that we can meet and accommodate and modify for those needs and ensure that we offer them a free and appropriate public education. So when I would think about the science of reading, I would think, yes, and students are never just learning to read. They are manifesting other things. They may very simply be digesting their food. They're still growing. They're thinking about other things. They're processing what happened to them that morning. You know, there's never only one thing going on in the system of a body. And when you talked about learning science and the science of learning, it just helped to name the many things that are happening, especially in it for a young child who's seated in a classroom when they are processing how to learn to read. And the teachers who are attempting to engage all of those students in that process.
I think your terms in like yes and is exactly what I want us to be talking more about, because the science of reading is essential, but not sufficient. The science of learning is essential, but not sufficient. And so I think for so many years, we tend to try to silo things when really what we're talking about is the integration of these sciences around a person, a child, a human, which is very different than, building a bike, for example. So, I think that's that yes and is what's really important in the conversation as we move forward.
We really want to focus our conversation today about implementation science, because you as a scholar, you and your role in the Reading League, me and my role at Lexia, we are all starting to think and talk and lean much more into implementation science. So I will certainly share with you, but would love to ask you first, what piqued your interest and the Reading League's interest in implementation science?
I think what's so essential about implementation in the time we're in now is that knowledge isn't enough. Knowledge is our basis, but it isn't enough. And I think that's what's really piqued our interest is in implementation science, which has gone by some kind of different names in the past, right? We've thought about action research. We've thought about different kinds of iterative ways. But what implementation science is really helping us think about is what happens when the knowledge meets the student and what happens in that interaction between the teacher, her students, the materials she might have. That interaction is the implementation science in some ways. And so I think what's really piqued our interest is that it's not just pouring knowledge into an educator and expecting that change is going to happen. We really have to get our hands dirty. We have to muck around in that interaction. And that's the implementation science part. And if we're not willing to kind of roll up our sleeves and get in there, we're not really going to see the changes that we all want to happen for our students. So really, it's the impetus, a continual impetus for change that is helping us think about the interactions around these pieces.
At Lexia, we feel it's very important to define our terms clearly. We always want to make sure we are defining our terms clearly. And I know that you've sat in rooms the same way that I have sat in rooms, and we believe we are having the same conversation. And then we start to break down our terms and we're all like, whoa, that's not what I meant at all. And it turns out we're all defining things a little bit differently. So when we think about implementation science and the science of reading at Lexia, we are thinking of implementation science as a means to close the gap between what we know about literacy acquisition and the implementation of that knowledge in the classroom. So really seeking to close the gap between what we know and what we actually do. And often that can be closed by identifying and addressing barriers to evidence-based practices. And I think often when systems leaders and classroom leaders are thinking about transformation, they're thinking about what do we have to do that's different? What do we have to learn and execute that's different? And thinking less about what are the barriers to that implementation? How do we remove those barriers? And what are we going to do less or not at all in order to ensure we can build the muscle memory toward that evidence-based practice? So I would love to talk to you a little bit about what you're learning about implementation science, what you're learning about cycles of implementation, what implementation is and is not, and how the Reading League is talking to and working with partners to ensure that science of reading transformation can truly land in student achievement so that we can achieve the 95% of all children reading and writing and speaking with confidence that the science tells us is possible.
You know, we've talked in education a lot about this research to practice gap and the lag time that we know happens. And what implementation science is for me is really trying to close that gap in a more rapid way than we have in the past. And so, when we think about implementation science, we really want to talk an awful lot about the realities. And I think that is often lost in kind of lofty theoretical conversations. And so when you're bringing up the barriers, Kerri, those are the realities. The barriers that happen in schools are the realities of what our educators and our leaders are dealing with each and every day. And unless we acknowledge them and bring them forward in a real constructive way, we're not going to get to the change that we need. And so, at the Reading League, we've been talking an awful lot about how we're moving our professional learning from knowledge building only to then knowledge building directly connected to the classroom materials and practices that teachers have each and every day. That one shift in some ways can be monumental. So just give you a really quick example. Teachers engage in a professional learning session together around database literacy instruction. Great. Really helps them understand terms, helps them understand why this is important. But if we don't take the next step to sit down with a grade level team, lay out their data and go, all right, how do we take what you just learned about data-driven literacy instruction and apply it with your own data, with your own kids, and with the materials that you have in your classroom to support you each and every day, then where will we think the change will happen? And so that's a shift we're making in order to really bring forth the realities and to make direct connections to teachers between what is often kind of disparate initiatives in their world, right? We get a new curriculum. We have a new assessment. Has anybody talked together about how those pieces go in some way? And so I think that is where we're really trying to bring the implementation science really to life in a very concrete way for the educators that we work with every day, and then spreading that word out much more broadly around what we know it's going to take to make change.
That's such an excellent and compelling and sometimes scary thought, because that word desperate can mean so many things. Like, we may have all the pieces, but do those pieces fit together? Does that assessment generate data that is diagnostic enough to tell us about this child's instructional needs and point us to an instructional solution that we can then execute in the classroom? And do I have the tools and the pedagogy at my fingertips in order to do that? And is that the way my instructional day has been designed, so that I also have the space and the collaboration to make those decisions? And frequently the answer is we're in the process of doing that. But it takes all of those cogs working together to make that happen. And I think some of what I know the Reading League is thinking about, some of what we're thinking about as Lexia, is how very many pieces need to be working together in order to generate lasting and sustainable literacy achievement in students. So we actually see the student results. Each of these steps is important, but it doesn't matter if we haven't meaningfully invested in a long-term implementation that's going to take years and constant, fearless analysis, where we are following what that data tells us and not crossing our fingers and hoping we made the right choices 3 years ago when we were told to pick between two curriculums.
It's so true. And I think that in our best efforts, we keep adding to. And so, that's where we end up in situations where we see, 6 different curriculums in an elementary school in terms of intervention materials. And a teacher doesn't know what they're supposed to use or why they're supposed to use it, but they have all these resources, but no one's supported the implementation of how this is going to come to life. And, that's the challenge. I mean, it's not easy. And it's easier to just buy more stuff. And I think that's the issue here.
Yeah. We are talking to a lot of districts about curating, about what it means to curate your resources from top to bottom and really hold on to those evidence-based solutions that are yielding outcomes. And sometimes it's very challenging to determine what is in fact yielding an outcome if you've been so overwhelmed by the sheer volume of resources available because the implementation hasn't been meaningful. I want to share with you a story, a data story from Lexia, and then I have a specific question for you, and that question is about the F word, because you introduced that scholarly term to me the last time I saw you in Boston. But, at Lexia, we are so very, very proud of our efficacy research. We are so proud to serve millions of students. We are so proud of what students achieve, particularly our students who are engaged in two of our SAS products, Core 5 and Power Up. Children can recover years of learning in a year or less. And they can do that when they fulfill the prescription that has been prescribed. And when their teachers are unable to fulfill the prescription for whatever reason, then the results are not as impressive. And so what has become clear to us is that we can promise results as long as the programs are implemented with, and here comes the F word, fidelity. And there are so many barriers to implementation with, F word alert, fidelity, that we really need to partner differently with our districts to understand what is in the way of that implementation. And we are used to thinking and talking about, well, what more or different do you need, instead of what is getting in the way of creating more skill and agility with the tools that you already have. So that's one of the reasons that Lexia is really leaning into implementation science research, so that we can ensure that our partners are able to implement evidence-based tools with fidelity. And I would love for you to talk a little bit about why you are calling fidelity an F word these days, and some better words we may be able to use, and why our word choice is important.
The F word, it's the best because it really gets people to pay attention. And honestly, I feel like a lot of teachers, classroom teachers, are like, if you tell me one more time to implement with fidelity, I'm going to lose it. And it's because fidelity often equals rigidity. Fidelity often equals, to a teacher, don't think, just do. And that's not actually what fidelity is, but that is often how it's been implemented. Are you on the right pacing guide? Are you doing X on this same day? Which then leads teachers to feel like, I can't be responsive. I'm just enacting what's in front of me. And so I've been really thinking about kind of shifting the word fidelity to integrity. And I think the example that you just gave is that when you understand the design of a program, the reason why it is set up the way that it is set up, what is necessary for the program to be successful with students, then it's not about fidelity necessarily, blind fidelity. It's more about, am I implementing this with integrity? Am I maintaining the design aspects that are research-based, that the research shows is what's going to make a difference for kids? Now, that doesn't mean we can't make adaptations, but we're making adaptations within the realm of understanding that design. And I think that often that nuance gets lost in the word fidelity. And I think it's, at this point now it's tainted. So we got to move on. We got to figure out another way to talk about exactly what it is that you're saying, that your research shows with this level of implementation, we see a difference. When you don't have that, or you're not meeting that, the results will be different. And so opening that up and having that dialogue is what's really essential in order to know, like, no, friend, it's not working because you're only giving it to kids 10 minutes once a week. Sorry, that's not going to move the needle. And so thinking about fidelity versus integrity maybe in some way, or being clear about what are the adaptations, what are the ways in which teachers may be responsive to students, depending on what they have, can be a part of the conversation that I think is really necessary.
I think it is so necessary to include teacher voices in these conversations because we really don't know what is interfering with the implementation. And certainly there is more than one barrier to implementation. And I think when we use words like fidelity, they may be pejorative and there may be an accusation in there that somehow the teacher is at fault for not fulfilling the prescription instead of wondering why the conditions were such that the teacher was unable to provide the conditions that allowed for that prescription to be fulfilled. I know when you and I were talking about implementation science and you were helping me better understand where does this science come from. And we talked about medicine and we talked about military and we've talked about other institutions who have really been leading the way in implementation science for years and made me think of an analogy of strep throat, which is something I've suffered from my whole life. So if the doctor prescribes something to me for strep throat and says you have to take it twice a day for a week, and I don't want to because my throat hurts. So the first day I take it once, and the second day I take it once, and the third day I don't take it, and then the fourth day I take it twice, and the second day I don't take it, and then I don't get well. You can't say the medicine didn't work. I mean, I didn't use it correctly. And so I think we want to, and then, that maybe becomes the question of if a person is in that much pain, maybe an oral medication isn't the answer.
Right.
So like, well, what is the barrier to taking a horse-sized pill when your throat is closed? I mean, it's a different analogy, but I think if you are in a position to have very respectful conversations with the people who are trying to implement with fidelity because they chose this career path to help children in part read and write and speak with confidence, what is the barrier to your use of this tool that all of our evidence tells us will support in that endeavor? And amplifying that voice, because too frequently we talk about teachers without speaking to or listening to the teachers who are doing the work.
Without a doubt. And I would offer, Kerri, that in my experience, the majority of the barriers are at a systems level and are outside of the locus of control of the individual educator. And so even that notion of bringing up fidelity does give that impression that the educator themselves is somehow withholding something. And it's just such an important nuance to the conversation to move it forward.
I don't want to terribly put you on the spot, but I love that call out that really often the conditions for teaching are set at the systems level. And so if there is an implementation challenge, it is likely a systems challenge. So would you be able to give us an example of a systems challenge that may impact a teacher's ability to implement with integrity?
I think the number one that I hear the most in my work is the schedule. So the teacher often does not set the school-wide schedule in any kind of way, but there is an expectation that their students spend a 90-minute reading block. I'm just making this up, but just as an example, a 90-minute reading block, 30 minutes must be spent on this program, 30 minutes must be spent on that program. Lunch happens at 10:15, PE happens here. When you put all of those pieces together, the time doesn't actually play out. So when we're thinking about the prescription, if there is quite literally not the time set aside in the day for the student to have the prescription, that's not at the teacher level. That's at a systems level in some way. It's the same thing in terms of like when you're implementing a program that happens to be on a computer and the teacher doesn't have the number of devices that are necessary. Like those, they seem so small and so kind of like duh, but that's the reality of classrooms each and every day is there's an expectation that I'm supposed to do X, but I don't even have the tools to do it, and you still want me to make it happen. That's that systems level work that's like, if your expectation is this, by God, you better ensure that the teacher has every single tool and you have paved the way for that to exist. And the reality is that very rarely happens.
Because we need for our systems leaders to think so much more deeply about what this transformation really means. It is not enough to acquire and execute on new stuff.
Yeah.
We need to transform each system, each cog in the system, and then make sure that the system is running smoothly in order for that transformation to reach the classroom and every child in that classroom, for that momentum to sustain itself and for those gains to evidence themselves.
What is that?
Which is possible.
Yeah, I was just thinking, like, what is that statistic that talks about, like, the number of decisions that a teacher makes in a day, right? It's like more than a emergency room physician or whatever that may be. But I think sometimes we lose sight of how a very small barrier multiplies in the classroom when you are dealing with so many mitigating factors. And so I feel like sometimes when listeners will hear me say, well, they don't even have enough computers, the answer is just put more computers in. Yes, but what does that take for the teacher to do that? Does she have to send an email to the district, to that? You know what I mean? It's just like it gets compounded, these kinds of things that seem small, but actually at a systems level could be managed so much more than kind of laying the onus on the individual educator to solve that.
Right. The last time that you and I were in the room together in Boston and you delivered a keynote address, you all but received a standing ovation for one simple word, and that word was de-implementation. So if you are going to ask me to transform instruction and learn about the science of reading and its implementation in the classroom, which is known as structured literacy, what are you going to take off my plate? And so often the answer to teachers is nothing. We're taking nothing off your plate, but we're going to ask you to completely relearn how you taught reading and do everything differently, except for everything you've always done. So you're going to do that too. And then you said, no, actually, de-implementation is every bit as much of an implementation plan as the acquisition of new stuff. So talk to us a little bit about de-implementation. I want to share with you something I learned because your keynote address made me very excited because it made people so happy to hear about de-implementation. But tell us a little bit about the role of de-implementation in implementation science.
For sure. Just saying that people don't talk about this enough. So thank you for giving me a soapbox to stand on around this because it's so essential. When we think about de-implementation, let's really define it, which is really about intentionally stopping or scaling back or replacing practices that are ineffective, misaligned with evidence, or doing harm. Even if they are things we've been doing for a long time, they're familiar in some way. And I think this really boils down to improvement is not just about adding better practices. It's about having the courage to really stop doing the things that are no longer serving kids. That's a really difficult part of the conversation that I often think we don't acknowledge. Teaching is very personal, and we view ourselves as teachers, and what we do so much is for the children. And so to be told to stop doing something can be hard. But that conversation is so important because schools, districts, everyone is initiative fatigued. All we honestly keep doing is layering one thing on top of the other. I think about it in terms of like the closet where you just keep shoving more in and like hoping that the door will close. And then one day it just doesn't because we've lost it. And so the science of reading not only helped us identify gaps in our instruction, but it identified some misalignments in our instruction. And so we cannot implement the science of reading well if we're still protecting practices that contradict it. And that's where I feel like those open and honest conversations about what are we going to either stop doing reduce, or replace have to be very, very overt and clear in order for change to really take root in some way.
I think that's such a lovely answer because it acknowledges both sides of the de-implementation experience. It's that first initial urge of, okay, if you're going to ask so much more of me, what are you taking off my plate? What do I get to do less of? But then please don't take away from me something that is a valued practice or a dear part of my routine or something that my mentor, who I love, taught me to do 25 years ago, and something that I've come to cherish over time. None of us, I think many of us teach because it's who we are. It's not what we do. It's in our blood. We couldn't do anything else. So to stop doing something is a big deal. I was just with a group of educators from the New England and Mid-Atlantic regions. And one of the educators gave a great analogy, which is, for longevity and good health, I know what I should be eating. I know what a healthy diet looks like. I know how much sleep I should be getting. I know how much exercise I should be getting. Like, my brain knows these things. But do I do that every day? No, I don't do that every day because those are not my habits or my routines. I might pick up a few new recipes, but I don't just do that every day because change is very hard. And asking people to change is very hard. And so when we're adding things, we do have to remove things. And sometimes removing things is an enormous relief. And sometimes removing things is a great loss.
Yep, it really, really is. And that's why I get a little itchy when we talk about, banning practices, which I understand the intent, right? But what we're really talking about is not only abandonment, because if we do want to abandon a practice, what are we doing instead? And why is what we're doing instead that much better, that much more effective, whatever the case may be? And I think those honest conversations around some practices are really important. And the example I have that I think about often is like comprehension strategy of the week, right? For many of us who came into teaching in the late 90s, early 2000s, comprehension strategy instruction was really important. That's kind of how we were taught. There was a depth of knowledge that was different. Why doesn't that work anymore? And if I'm not supposed to do that, what does it look like to do what I should be doing, and why is it different or better? I mean, I think the transparency around why something is stopping and honoring our past intentions while still replacing with the learning is where we need to go. So it's not like, we did these things because we were careless. No, we did these things because we don't know what we know now. And so let's talk through that. Absolutely. 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 I always say, like, nobody goes into teaching saying, I'm going to be a really bad teacher. That's my goal.
Right.
So
right. I'm going to mess these kids up.
Totally. So it really is about, for me, in de-implementation, it is the transparency. It is the inventory in some way. Like, what is it that's actually happening? And what is it that we need to do differently and why? But I know I keep hitting the word transparency over and over again because I think often the de-implementation is theoretically implicit. Well, you should know to not do guided reading groups anymore. Well, really? Who said that? What part of it wasn't? What am I supposed to do instead? So I think that making the implicit explicit is actually what will move the needle, and that happens through those de-implementation conversations.
I read a really interesting meta-analysis, and it was in a medical journal, but I want to share with you some of what I learned, and I want to discuss if it resonates with your understanding of de-implementation in an educational setting, because a lot of the implementation science comes from medical or military settings, although there are some great organizations and individual researchers who are doing implementation science in the educational setting. But this was the effectiveness of de-implementation of low-value healthcare practices, an overview of systematic reviews. This is from August of 2024, so it's pretty recent. So it's a meta-analysis looking across multiple studies that were implementing effective practices while also de-implementing low-value healthcare practices. So it was looking at strategies that teams were using around practice. And they are strategies that we know and use in education. Things like, well, you train and you educate your stakeholders. You support the clinicians doing the work. You evaluate the strategies that you're using. You might have to change your workflow a little bit. But what the study found that I thought was so interesting was, well, of all of these practices noted across multiple studies, which practices actually de-implemented the low-value practice? So what actually helped people remove the low-value practices? So the first thing that actually helped to remove ineffective practice was the change of infrastructure and workflow. So changing what the day-to-day work looked like. Number 2 was adapting and tailoring to the context. And number 3 was developing stakeholder interrelationships. And those are 3 things that we rarely discuss in education. So I found them so interesting because those are not conversations that I'm having yet with district leaders. And I wonder if those findings resonate with you, if you've encountered them in your research, if you are having them yet with your stakeholder groups, or if you and I are about to lead a revolution. And this is what we're going to start talking about.
I do think we're about to lead a revolution because these conversations aren't happening. And when you're talking about what the study found, it makes me think of the word coherence. And coherence continues to be kind of the bane of education's existence. And when we think about those particular aspects that you just brought forward from the meta-analysis, they're around coherence of systems, right? It's the idea, going to an education example. If we're asking teachers to stop doing a practice, but that practice is on every walkthrough form and or teacher evaluation form, we have a real coherence issue there. And that sounds ridiculous, but that's the reality in lots of places. And so we have to be thinking about the system as a whole and how does the system pave the way for the individual educator to do the work. And that happens in lots of ways through coherence. And I'm thinking about, districts often have an implementation problem, but they also have a capacity problem, right? So de-implementation can support leaders in thinking about how do I create time, coherence, and attention on the things that matter by intentionally stopping or reducing the things that aren't of value. That's where we buy ourselves time, which we're always, freaking out that we don't have enough of. But it is the coherence of these systems that are so necessary in order to set the conditions.
We always say at Lexia and through letters, teaching reading is rocket science. It is a very complex thing to build a neuronal pathway. And that is what we're doing when we're teaching children to read. And it requires a change in infrastructure and workflow to the reading block. It doesn't completely redesign the entire school day, but it would mean a change in infrastructure and workflow for teachers of reading and the adults who support in that process. And that's not something that a lot of teams are ready to take on. And I think the idea of developing stakeholder interrelationships around implementation and de-implementation is also something that strikes a chord in me, because when I listen to district leaders, and I say this quite a bit because it really, I hear it frequently enough that I want to amplify the message. District leaders who have been very successful in leading science of reading transformation will frequently say, if they had it to do all over again, they would begin the transformation with administrative professional learning. They would train administrators first on what the science of reading pedagogy and practice truly is, so that they can begin the language and the systems reform necessary to create the conditions for teachers and students to be successful.
I wholeheartedly agree with that. A cosine times 100 on that one, because it is the leaders that set the conditions. It is. And we often kind of want to start at the direct level. We want to start with the teachers because the teachers are the ones that are touching the kids each and every day. And I get that. But they cannot survive in an ecosystem that is not set up for that change. And that is where the leaders have the most impact on their work. I think too, I was just going to say, like, I'm thinking about the stakeholder relationship part, because I think resistance in de-implementation is also not talked about quite enough. For the reasons we talked about already, teaching is personal. De-implementation often can involve loss. And that acknowledgement of like loss of identity or loss of investment or fear of being blamed, leaders have to be prepared to be able to talk through that, to push through that, to normalize that emotional reality while still trying to move things forward. And the people stuff is where things get hard. Right? It's the stakeholder relationship is also in terms of maintaining the status quo is often safer, quote unquote, although we're not doing right by our kids. And so supporting leaders with the emotional and or people skills necessary to honor the intentions, but we still have to change the practice. And that is some nuance that I think is an important part of the conversation and areas where leaders may need some additional support.
I worked with a superintendent who used to say, culture eats strategy.
So
and if you ignore your culture, you can have the best strategic plan in the whole wide world, and your culture will not allow for that strategy to unfold. So I appreciate you really naming that as a challenge for school systems and district leaders. So Marisa, for people who are listening who might be interested in learning more about implementation science, where would our audience go to become well informed about the science and some of the organizations who are helping lead the way?
You know, Dr. Tiffany Hogan has been doing a lot of work on implementation science. She's out of Mass General, and her work with a couple of her doc students has been really impactful. There are some open access pieces that are really important. There's also a book that I have found really powerful for my own work. It's called De-Implementation. It's by Peter DeWitt. And he really was one of the first people, I feel like, to use that word in that way when it comes to education. And he talks about, you know, educators just being buried is the word he uses under old practices. And so how do we systematically really cultivate, curate what it is that's going to move the needle? So I think those are the two people I'm learning from the most right now. And of course, just our own work at the Reading League and what we're seeing each and every day with the schools and districts that we work with is also just so illustrative in kind of bringing these pieces to life.
Well, thank you very much, Marisa, for sharing your expertise with us today. We know that the science of reading is a guiding light for so many of us and so many of our school districts. And we know that literacy is about so much more than words on a page. We know literacy is independence and critical thinking and dignity and community engagement and work and advanced education. For many of us, reading is also a true and genuine pleasure. So in that spirit, I ask you, what are you reading for pleasure these days?
So I have to tell you about a book that I have found so interesting and also illuminated how much I do not know about things, which is one of my favorite things that a book teaches you. I'm reading a book called The Radium Girls, the women who fought for their lives.
Okay.
It is a narrative nonfiction book about the women who worked in the 1920 factories with radium and were painting the watch dials because radium, glows. And it was before they knew how incredibly poisonous radium was. They would actually take the brushes and put them in their mouth to make the points that much more fine, and then paint the watch dials. And it was women's work because they were very, attention to detail and all of the things. And what was happening to their bodies was really unknown to the scientific community. And it's about their battle for workplace safety reforms, in particular with radium. And the fact that it's women in the 1920s who were really looking for independence, and that's why they worked. It's a fascinating story. I didn't know squat about radium. I didn't know anything about that. But it is a fascinating book, The Radium Girls. Highly recommend.
The Radium Girls. Well, I have my book right here, and it's so pretty. I want to show it to you. It's called The Service Berry. This was, and it's narrow. Look, it's thin. Too. It's easy to take. Easy to take on the airplane. It's The Service Berry, Abundance and Reciprocity in the Natural World by Robin Wall Kimmerer, who you may recognize her name. She wrote Braiding Sweetgrass, which I believe won a National Book Award. She is a natural scientist and an indigenous leader. And this book is about an economy of abundance in nature versus an economy of scarcity that we sort of live in on a national scale. This narrow little book is so dense. The minute I finish, I'm going to go right back to the beginning and reread it, because it's about nature and the biology of nature and how nature copes with abundance and what that could mean to an economy of scarcity that we navigate, and what might it mean to have an economy of abundance, and how that changes our interactions with one another and with our neighbors and with nature. But it brings in just all of these components of the natural world, of economics. It's deeply feminist. It's deeply human. It's really lovely.
Now I'm going to have to read that, because quite literally yesterday I was talking about changing a mindset from a mindset of scarcity to a mindset of abundance. And what does that do for us in our work and in our lives if we actually have that view rather than the opposite? So no, that's on my list now, Kerri. That's happening.
That's what this book is, and it will make you want to read Braiding Sweetgrass, because now I want to read that next. It is a little bit intellectually intimidating. I'm not going to lie about that. It is a small but dense, rich read. You have to pay careful attention to it, but it is well worth the effort.
Love it.
Marisa, I want to thank you so much for sharing your experience and your insights with us. As always, you are a delight, and I so enjoy the opportunities that you and I have to work together, and I look forward to our next opportunity to work together, wherever that may be.
I cannot wait. Thank you for having me. Thank you for asking me such interesting questions. And I can't wait to hear any feedback you get from our conversation, just to keep ourselves going.
Absolutely. Well, it is clear that making this shift to the science of reading is going to take all of us working together and learning from one another. So if you and our listening audience found today's conversation helpful, please be sure to subscribe, share this episode with your learning community, and connect with us on social media. Let's keep this collaboration going. We would love to hear from you. Thank you very much.